Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. In the last lecture we ended with the image of Shiva Nataraja, and Shiva Nataraja that we see here in this Chola context to be performing this Ananda Tandava dance, and in this particular image we also see that there is this superb use of bronze, and this bronze casting, something that we see here, this is the same process of lost wax process that was there in the Harappan times. So that small image of a dancing woman that we have studied in the Harappan context, it followed a similar kind of technical aspect that we see them to be much more sophisticatedly utilized in the image of Shiva Nataraja here in the 10th and 11th century. So this is also something that we can think about, that how this knowledge of bronze casting that we have studied in the earlier context, in the Harappan context, in the Indus Valley context, so those knowledges were actually not lost, but perhaps there had been pockets in the Indian subcontinent where those knowledge were nurtured, and then it had its manifestation in the Chola court and in part of in the Kaveri Delta. So the town of Swamimalai, even today, that is near Tanjavur, they practice this art of making, or the craft of making, these bronze icons. Now, in terms of these bronze icons, we see not only Shiva Nataraja, and as I have already mentioned that these images were not really placed in the Garbhagriha, but they were meant for the processions, they were meant for being taken out to the public on chariot and so on, and that is the reason we find the holes in the pedestal of these images through which threads were passed on, and then they were attached to bamboo poles and things like that, and then they were carried on the shoulder of the people. So that is the reason we find this particular characteristic feature is very important in all this most of these Chola bronzes. Now, apart from the image of Shiva Nataraja, except for the Garbhagriha or the womb chamber of the Shiva temple at Chidambaram, that is also there in the Kaveri, that is also there by the in the Kaveri Delta region, which is very close to the Bay of Bengal. That is the place where we find where a bronze icon of Shiva Nataraja is placed in the sanctum. Apart from that, mostly in the temples we find that there are abstracted representation of Shiva in form of a lingam that is placed in the Garbhagriha, and these Utsava murtis or this ceremonial bronze figures, they are placed in the sides, or in the other chambers, and they are only taken out during this particular occasions. Now, apart from this particular representation of Shiva as Shiva Nataraja, we also see the image of Ardhanarishwara that made its impact here. So one of the images that we have here, that is from the Chola dynasty, and that there in the Government Museum, Chennai, and this is one of the fine examples of how the idea of Ardhanarishwara that came into that manifested in this Chola bronzes. So we have touched upon this theme when we were looking into the cave temple of Elephanta, and where there is a face of Parvati or Vamadeva, and then how Shiva's different aspects, they sort of came together. And here in this bronze icon, what we have, that half of the body is of Shiva, this part of the body where there are two hands, and then he also holds an axe, which is also part of the South Indian iconography of Shiva, and this part of the body belongs to a goddess Parvati, and that is how we see that in one part of the body there is a breast, but the other part of the body there is not, and then this part of the body there is this lower flowy garment, which is also a well-known kind of iconographical trait for the goddesses and the women in these bronzes, whereas here we only see that for Shiva there is a loincloth kind of or a short dhoti like garment, which is also associated with Shiva being an ascetic. So these are the different aspects that we find they have played out, and so those are the ways in which we find how the iconography and the complexity of temple building, they were side by side, and they went together with the technological explorations in terms of making bronze, and also all the other kind of exploration in terms of giving this super balance. For example, how this tri-body bent here, that also is utilized superbly with one of the hands raised outside, and then here how that is balanced with only one hand, this two hands, and here one hand. So all these different aspects we find that artistic, iconographical, religious aspects, and the technological aspects, all of them, they come together in these bronze icons like them. Now from there we also find that how there have been very different, very important patrons of the temples. For example, we see the figure of Sembian Mahadevi in the Chola context, and she was active in the late 10th century and early 11th century. So we see that how the women patrons also were, they had their important roles in terms of patronizing the temples, as well as their contribution to the administrative aspects of the state, as well as running the entire state and so on. So these are some of the things we find, and then we also see that how this idea of the gender, and then if a temple is dedicated to a goddess as opposed to a god, how that also made a huge deal of impact in terms of the way in which architecture is perceived. So there is a example, and now from Tamil Nadu we are moving back to the northern and central India. Now here is another example from the city of Bhubaneswar, and as I have said that in Bhubaneswar there have been many different kind of temple building activities during this time. So between 7th century to 12th century there have been many phases in which different temples were built, and this is a temple, this is called Vaitala temple or Vaitala Deol, and this is a temple that we find that is called, it has 3 spires, or this is called the Tin Mundia temple. And Tin Mundia temple, that basically means that it does not have one mundi or a shikhara, but there are tin mundi, or like 3 shikharas. So for example, this. So we see 3 amalaka stones instead of 1, and then 3 kalashas on the top of them. So this is a unique kind of temple that we find that this is not really common in most of the places. So even though we have seen this barrel roof kind of structure, but that was not really there usually for the shikhara of the temple, and also there was not really 3 amalaka stones on the top of them. So in those ways we certainly find this temple to be very different from many other temples that we have studied. And the reason for that is that this particular temple, Vaitala temple, is dedicated to the goddess, the supreme goddess, and her 3 manifestations. So since there are 3 manifestations of the goddess, they are enshrined in this temple. So that's the reason they have 3 amalaka stones on the top of it. So basically, instead of 1 axis mandi, one can imagine that there are 3 axis mandi which is running vertically, and then by those axis mandis there are the images of the goddesses in the garbhagriha or in the womb chamber, right? So that is, these are some of the contextual aspects in which we find that how even though there were some of the uniform rules for making the temples, and as we also make a distinction between what is South Indian temple, what is North Indian temple, but these are some of the ways in which we also find that this specific context, that if a temple is dedicated to to these three goddesses, how the architecture is also treated very different from the ones where only one prime god or goddess is placed. So these are some of the examples that also tell us that how the treatise on architecture, they have also changed with depending on for whom these are built and all these different aspects. From there we also find that there are some of the these temples which are dedicated to not one or two figures but 64 figures, and that is something we find that is there in the yogini temples, and the yogini temples are there in different parts of eastern and central India. So for example, we have one of the celebrated yogini temple in Hirapur in Odisha, and that particular site is not just known for their practices related to Tantrism in Hinduism, but also for Vajrayana tantric practices in Buddhism. So what we find in the temple of Hirapur, that instead of like in this temple complex we have this circular kind of orientation that is there in the inner part of the temple, and then there are 64 cells, and 64 cells will have, like, each of the cells will have one image of the yoginis. The yoginis are the ones who have assisted the great goddess during various wars, and they are also been considered to be they are the knowledgeable ones. So in one hand they are the valiant ones, they are the brave ones, but they are also the knowledgeable ones, and that is the reason we find that they hold high significance in the tantric practices as well as in the practices where the power of the great goddess is celebrated. So for that also we find to enshrine the 64 goddesses or the demigoddesses, the temple was also built in particular way. So in this temple in Hirapur we have like all these cells which have the images of this yoginis. They sort of surround this entire interior of this temple complex, and it's very much an open air temple instead of having a overarching roof on the top of the entire place. We see there is only a small shrine in the center of this in the center of this temple which has a roof, but apart from that it's an open air temple, and that shrine is dedicated to Lord Shiva, and Lord Shiva is also someone who's been associated with the tantric practices. Now moving from there, we also find that there are temples, for example, and this temple in Hirapur in Odisha that comes from 9th century. So after that we find that there are some of the other temples in central India and parts of eastern India and so on, where this kind of strategy has been utilized, and this is one of the sites. For example, here we have this particular site where in Morena in Madhya Pradesh, where this Chausa Yogini temple was built in the 11th century, and if you see the structure of it, how there is this open air temple like structure, and then there is a central shrine, but then there are all those cells or all those smaller shrines which sort of encircle the central one, and then the rest of the area of the temple is empty, making it almost like a courtyard with this covered cells around it. So for its circular orientation, this is also something that people have suggested, how this particular temple site, which has 64 cells, and for that reason it had the necessity to be in this circular fashion, that also made an impact on making the Indian Parliament in the 20th century. So circle being relevant in geometry, which is one of the most stable shapes on the earth, and that is the reason we also find that how that was utilized in talking about state administration for making the parliament building. However, here we find the circular shape actually had a very different kind of purpose to serve, and that is to enshrine all those 64 goddesses or the demigoddesses in this one particular site. So from there, if we go a little further, and this is perhaps the final stage of temple building that we find in central and northern India, and here we are here in this image at the site of Khajuraho, again in Madhya Pradesh, and in Khajuraho we find the temple building activities. They were patronized by the Chandela rulers, and the Chandela rulers, we find them to be active in this site of Khajuraho between 10th and 11th centuries, and during this time period we find around 23 temples were built. So in Khajuraho, in this site, there are those groups of temples, the western group, the eastern group, the southern group, and so on. And so in this areas we find both Hindu, Jain temples are there, and also these are the temples that we have there, these 23 temples. And the Jain temples, they also have similarities with the Hindu temples. However, in cases we have found that the Jain temples also have certain differences from the Hindu temples. Since we are focusing on the Hindu temples for this module, so I'll be looking into little of the details, those we find in this final stage of Hindu temple architecture in the 11th century. So this is here one of the examples that we have on screen in the left side, and that is Kandaria Mahadev temple, and this is of course a temple that is dedicated to Lord Shiva. And here what we find that the temple, it does not just stands as a metaphor of the Mount Meru or Mount Kailasha, but it actually rises as this mountain. So it has this high ambition of almost turning into a mountain. So this mountain metaphor we have see here, it almost like materialized, it is actualized by making this temple. So apart from that, what are the aspects of this? What are the different parts of the temple if we see it? So I'll start from this beginning. So this is the area through which the visitors can or the devotees can enter the temple complex, and here we see there is this entrance porch. This is a small area, and this is the area which is called Ardha Mandapa. So Ardha Mandapa is, of course, as we can imagine that this is not a full mandapa, but this is just the Ardha Mandapa through which one can just approach the temple. And another important part is that we see the temple is situated on a high platform, and much higher from the ones we have seen in Pattadakal or in Bhubaneswar and so on. So this high platform or Jagati, that also that also announces its divine presence, and how this temple is not part of our mundane life, but this is on an elevated plane. So then on the top of that, when we see the Ardha Mandapa, from Ardha Mandapa one can go inside, and then there is the Mandapa. So Mandapa is also this another squarish space in which that is also utilized for people to gather there or take shelter. And we also see that how these temples, they are not totally covered, but there are areas here. For example, we can see how the pillars, and then there is open space for air and light to pass through these places, because these temples, the shikhara, or the structure, the superstructure of the temple is so heavy. So that's the reason to allow light and air within this within this structure. This kind of openings are very much part of them, as also thinking about the comfort and usability of these temples. So from there we find there is this Mahamandapa. So Mahamandapa is basically this large ceremonial halls so first from Ardha Mandapa, and if we can see it here, how there are those stairways, and from there we have this Ardha Mandapa here, and from there is the Mandapa, and Mandapa gets slightly larger than Ardha Mandapa, and from there we have this Mahamandapa, which is much more larger. It's a pillared hall, and then the Mahamandapa also has projections in both these sides. So these are the areas where we have the projections. So these projections are also the places through which it allows light and air through this into these structures, or else, as you can see, that apart from these openings there are no other ways through which light and air can be allowed inside the temple complexes. And then in this Ardha Mandapa, Mahamandapa, then we have this small area which is the vestibule or Antarala. Or Antarala is the place which sort of like, after the space expands, like if there is Ardha Mandapa, this is small, then there is Mandapa that gets slightly bigger in size, and then there is Mahamandapa that is much bigger than the Mandapa, and then there is a small passage. So then suddenly the space sort of squeezes, and something that we have already discussed in the earlier context, that how the mandapas are made as the ceremonial halls, but it's not necessary for all the devotees to sort of like go through the ceremonial hall to the Garbhagriha, and that is the reason there is a narrow pathway only to allow selected people to the Garbhagriha, and then there is the Garbhagriha, which is here that we find. Now in this plan we also find that within the temple structure there is this inner circumambulatory path. So the inner circumambulatory path is not just there in the outer area, but there is also something that is within the temple, something we have also seen in the context of the Raja Rajeshwara temple in Tanjavur. So those things, as I have said, that with time the temple building had become more and more complex. So those things we find them to be utilized in this structure. Now if these are the complexity in the ground plan, then what we see there in the outer side of the temple, there are many of these vertical projections, for example here, here, and then this replication of the shikhara or the superstructure, like for example this ones, we see that how they add to the central shikhara, they support the central shikhara, but at the same time it almost looks like that how the central shikhara has manifested itself into this smaller shikharas around it. So this is again this idea of the multiplication that we have already discussed in the Hindu context, how the universe each element that replicates and multiplies, and that is how the entire universe is formed, and all the complexity and everything that comes into existence. And as we have already said, that how this particular idea of all the multiplication, everything that also comes together in the form of a temple, how everything comes back to the creator. So those are the ideas that we find to be relevant in this temple here as well. And and also this the symbolism of the Mount Meru or the Mount Kailasha, that also comes alive in the way in which the tower rises on the top of this Garbhagriha. And usually we find that the tower that is there on the top of the Garbhagriha is the tallest one. So from there we will see the final stage of architecture in Odisha, and that is that will be the temple which is called the Konark temple, and it was built around 13th century by the Eastern Ganga dynasty rulers, and it is very close to the Bay of Bengal. And we see that this entire temple did not really survive. So there are we can see that only certain part of the temple that had survived, and as a in terms of its context, what we find, the entire temple was built as a chariot. So this is a temple, Konark temple, that is dedicated to the sun god, and that is the reason, the way in which in Hindu mythology, how the sun god is considered to ride his chariot or driven by 7 horses, and that is the reason we find the entire temple was conceptualized as a chariot. And around the temple we also find in these high platforms there are those wheels, the wheels of time, and also the wheels which symbolically run the temple. So this is the wheel of time in which the praharas, as like the hours, the way we understand like the division of time every day, those praharas are depicted in the spokes of the wheel. And then we also have one of the the stairways towards of this Mahamandapa or the Jagamohan, the way that is called in the Odishan architectural terms, that had the stairway, and by the stairway there were those 7 horses, they were depicted. So this symbolism of the sun god and the horse driven chariot, that came alive in this massive, this lofty monumental architectural complex. And in this complex we find that there have been reconstruction of this, the reconstruction of the plan and everything else, because the entire temple did not survive. And so this is the site which is called the Jagamohana, or the Mahamandapa, and at the back side of it there must have been this Shikhara. Now, why we considered this particular this temple which is now existing, that why this is not the Garbhagriha, because if we follow the architecture very closely, we know that this is not the superstructure that is used for Garbhagriha. So the Garbhagriha with curvilinear and the Shikhara which rises tall, that is very different from this pyramidal roof that we find here in this Mahamandapa. If we compare that to this mandapa here as well, so this also follows this pyramidal kind of the planning, which resembles the one that we see here in Konark, right. So that is how we can imagine that this particular part was not really the Garbhagriha or the main sanctum sanctorum, but it was the Mahamandapa which was adjoined to this temple. So these are the ways in which we find that by until 13th century, there's different ways in which the temple building activities that took place in the and how the idea of the Hindu temple was was practiced by the artisans, the sculptors, the architects in the different parts of the Indian subcontinent. So starting from the very beginning, if we think that how some of the simpler rock shelters and the cave temples, they were perceived as those womb chambers, this dark chamber where creation starts, where all of our lives start. So from there, if we think about it, then how the complexity of the the universe that came into be in this temple complexes. So those are the ideas we find that how from a very small unit it starts, and then it manifests into the most complex most complex entity that one can think about. So this is the range that we find that has been covered in the Hindu temples, and that is also something we have already stressed in the beginning of this lecture, that how these things do not really talk about that particular one way of life or one way of being, but it is multiplicity through which this ideas, the art practices and the Hindu philosophy that thrive. Thank you.